Welcome to Stay Sharp in Digital Engineering, your insider's edge on all things digital in the world of engineering, products, and manufacturing. In this episode of Stay Sharp, Jonathan and I bring in Derek Neiding to have a fun conversation about the things you need to know when selecting a product lifecycle management system. We get right down to brass tacks. So without more ado, let's tune in. Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp in Digital Engineering with Razorleaf. It's a podcast about all things digital related to products from engineering and manufacturing to service and beyond. I'm one of your hosts, Juliann Grant, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hello, everybody.
And it's great to be here with you. And today we're talking about PLM, one of our favorite topics, and some things you might need to know when you're evaluating a PLM system. And we're really pleased to have Derek Neiding back. Everyone knows Derek.
Hello, everyone.
And Derek heads up our business development and sales team here at Razorleaf, but has been here for many, many years, one of our very first employee. And so has a lot to say and know about things to think about when evaluating PLM systems.
Well, and has this conversation with people a lot, I expect, Derek.
Yes. Yeah, we do.
Yes. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things you need to consider and some of the gotchas about when you're in an evaluation, and we're going to jump right in with some questions around the process. We've seen some things here at Razorleaf, and when you're buying a PLM system or you're evaluating a PLM system, there are a lot of common mistakes that happen. And so we really want to make sure we have, kind of called out some of those things to your attention so you don't fall in those same traps. So let's dig in.
Yeah. I got one. I'll throw one out there right out of the gate. And Derek, I think I'm going to guess this is one that you've seen plenty, which is, are people getting the right people in their organization involved? Right? I mean, we talk about this in PLM. Is PLM, we actually got an episode on this, is PLM an engineering system, right? And, spoiler alert, I think in that episode we talked through, no, it shouldn't be because it's about product definition and product runs across all parts of your organization. But what do you see there, Derek? I mean, is that one of the things people run into?
That's right. And it really depends on who's kind of initiating the PLM project. Are they new to PLM and they're looking at some significant business change? And so that's why they're looking at a PLM system. And so maybe it's someone from, maybe even the sales organization that's thinking that they need a system to help them configure and quote their products better. Maybe there's an IT issue, a compliance issue, an end of life issue. And so now the IT department is the ones that are kind of heading up the selection of PLM. Or maybe it's engineering who is looking to get more efficient. And so regardless, there's generally kind of one group that is the one charged with spearheading, looking into this new system. And if you're not careful, you may just allow that group to kind of run it and lead it and not get the right people involved. And so regardless of the reason that you're looking for the PLM system, whether it's new or upgrade or change, regardless of the reason, you need to recognize that the PLM system is going to touch lots of parts of the business. And as it touches those other parts of the business, do we have representatives from those other parts of the business helping us to evaluate, get their needs out there? If not, we run a real risk of getting a solution that we kind of regret later.
Yeah, that's where silos come from, right? Is people focusing on just the thing that's in front of them, just the thing they care about. And that's supposed to be one of the benefits of managing the life cycle of your product, is that runs across departments, it runs across groups and different types of users. And you need to look at it holistically. And getting everybody involved is the right move.
And the thing is, there isn't like a standard template or standard outline, like you need these people involved and these people involved, because every company is going to be different. Right. If I come from a company where we have a heavy engineer configure to order product, then maybe I need a lot more sales involved. If I come from a company that is much more of a catalog sort of product, then maybe sales isn't so important, but maybe service is really important.
That's a good one. That's a really interesting one you highlight, right? The number of companies I've talked to, and it's sort of specific to certain industries where they say, oh yeah, margins on our product are okay. margins on our parts and our service, that's where we make our money, right?
Yeah.
And, do they involve that group when they make these choices about how to manage their whole product life?
Yeah, so it'd be nice if we could just hand you a template and say, you need, 10 hours a week of this guy and 15 hours a week of that guy. And if you have all these people involved, you'll make the right choice. But you really have to kind of step back and look at, what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, it goes back to one of the early podcasts, the caveman drawing sort of thing, right? I mean, PLM is a system that is, it's mimicking what we do for a living. So in order to select the right system, we have to know what we do for a living.
Well, I think there's another piece of that people should be aware of, and this isn't for everybody. It's not, it's not right on people's the front of their mind, but it's what you do today, and it's also, are you picking something flexible enough to help you if you change how you do things tomorrow, right? And I'll highlight this for some industries that are undergoing this kind of transformation. Oh, I sell a product. Oh, but tomorrow or next year or 5 years from now, maybe what I'm going to be selling is a service that uses that product, right? And if that's the case, you probably have to look at it differently. You pay more attention to warranty and repair and service and maintenance and managing the thing over its life. And, okay, well, did you think about all that when you went to select the product? So that's maybe a stakeholder group. You mentioned a bunch of different departments, Derek, but are you also involving executives? Are you asking them, where's the business headed? And are we picking the right tool to support us as we move into that?
Right, and that's I mean, the implementation of whatever the selected system is going to be a big project. So let's not do this every few years, right? Let's pick the one that can last us for a while. So you have to kind of think beyond that. Now you have to be careful to get into the analysis paralysis about like what is every direction our company could possibly go sometime in the future. You'll never get there. So clearly you're spending more time and more detail on the near term. But if you don't think about the long term, you could end up regretting that in just a few years.
I was just going to bring something about the executives and having a champion. I mean, I think that, one of the things that we see a lot too is when there isn't a champion or there isn't that executive level support, most enterprise projects end up failing. So, yeah.
No, that's another good point about getting the right people involved, because eventually you're going to have to pay for something. There's that too, right? But so I'm going to jump to another point that does tie right back to what we're saying about having so many people involved. And that is, I think another tip I would offer people when they're picking a PLM is to think about how they're going to manage their requirements for the system over the course of that process of picking the PLM and then implementing. But if you're going to have that many people involved, if you're going to do a decision by committee or with votes or different perspectives, do yourself a favor and get things down in writing where everybody can look at it, you can discuss it, you can understand it, you can organize it. So for me, that's a second tip, Derek. I mean, what do you see there? Do you see people doing it or forgetting to do it?
I see people doing it. I see them knowing that it needs to be done, but I see them also not doing it in a way that really is going to be useful, right? So we run into this problem internally, right? I say to marketing, can you give me such and such? And that's all I ask. And I think I've been clear on what we need. And marketing goes off and does what they do. They check the box and say, we delivered what you needed. And I look at it and I say, that's not what I needed. Right. And so the same thing can happen here, right? Is that we say that we need a PLM system to do this. And I believe I've been clear. And so I communicate that and other departments look at it. They're reading it a different way. And they say, yeah, that's right. We do need it to do that. So then how do we ever check the box and say that we've done it? Because we have. So I think what you're talking about is it's capturing the requirements, but are we really getting down to the use case sort of level of the requirements? Because that's where it really starts to get if I ask marketing for something and I also then give them an outline and I tell them I want it to be 2 pages with this many paragraphs and these kind of graphics, that's a whole lot different than just, can you give me one of these?
Right.
We would love that.
We're trying.
No, it's a great point. And I mean, it's something that we see in our consulting practice, right? And we were talking about how to pick a system here, not necessarily how to do the project. But I think it's important, like you said, that you think about what are the requirements for? Why are you writing them, right? Because I see people make the mistake of they think about the requirements from the perspective of just the system. And the fact is, if you're getting the right people together to talk about what they need is not software. What they need are processes enabled by software and practices, and they need data, and they need all the things, right? But they're going to think about what do they need the outcomes to be. Part of that is the software, right? So my thinking is don't get wrapped up in writing requirements for an RFQ or an RFP or a bake-off or that kind of thing. It's useful, right? It helps you keep focus on what you need to pick the right system. But remember, the requirements you're going to write are probably about the outcomes you need. And your advice, Derek, is right on point. Make sure it's clear. Everybody knows what you're looking for. Not, I need CAD management. Okay, right. For what CAD?
Right.
And what do you mean by CAD management? You just need to track the files, revs? What do you need? You need derivative output? What do you need? You got to be specific.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and that's, let's be honest, that's not a lot of fun, right?
Right.
These, if I'm implementing a new PLM system and it's got all kinds of cool new features that I didn't have before, and I'm thinking about how cool my job's going to be now that I get to use these new features, stepping back and really detailing, well, what do I need this to do? Like maybe even like down to the click by click level. It's not a lot of fun. But if you don't do it, the other thing by not having that, the other thing that causes is it may make the evaluation a little more difficult because, let's face it, most of these systems out there will do what they need to do for a manufacturing company. Some systems kind of tailor themselves a little bit more to this industry or that industry or this type of business, but they'll all do it. But do some need heavier customization for my kind of business? Would I be okay with what this system gives me out of the box? I thought this was my process, but out of the box, this system has the same process, but they do it differently. I could be okay with that if I don't have
and maybe even better, right?
Maybe even better,
yeah.
Right? And so if I don't have it at that level, how do I make that evaluation? And so now I'm looking at a system and it's going to be heavily customized. Meanwhile, I could have used out of the box processes, but I wasn't clear enough on kind of what I was trying to accomplish, what the end result needed to be.
I think, too, what happens with use cases is they just take a lot of time. And so people don't necessarily want to spend all that time, mapping out the specific scenarios that you're talking about. And you're right, they have to get pretty specific in some cases.
And I find that tricky, too. I mean, I think we're giving, I'll say I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth because I agree with what you guys are saying, but I'm going to say the opposite, too. You want to have specific use cases, but you also want to be flexible and open to the fact that one of these software providers might bring you a new process, a new technique, a new something that you want to adopt. And it's different than what you do today. So yeah, it's tricky. You want to be specific, but you also want to be flexible and open to what might be offered. I think you guys hit on something else important about use cases, right? And this flows later into that project you're going to do. Is that what you're going to use to test it? Is that what you're going to use to make sure you got it right? And did you take the time to get agreement on it? I think it ties back to something, Derek, you mentioned earlier, and I'm sure you see this all the time. One person who might be leading or focusing on the selection has got a view of what these requirements are, but it's not necessarily shared by everyone, right? So they want to buy based on, I'll use the example we've seen time and again. Engineering says, well, that CAD connector is so much better. It's going to make my engineers tons more efficient. Well, the rest of the business looks at it and they're like, well, but it doesn't, this system doesn't really do service management very well. And that's our bread and butter and profitability. But engineering's leading it. So they pick a PLM tool that's got the best CAD integration. And it turns out that means it's just a silo.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where we see this where and this happens a lot. It seems like kind of in the RFP world, where you kind of have rankings on your requirements, and these requirements are must-haves. If you have an organization that has hundreds of engineers that are extremely heavy CAD users, maybe the CAD integration is the top thing. And so there's maybe some value to some of that. But this goes back to the point earlier of really looking across the whole organization. One group is probably leading it, but we also don't want that, that term that we sometimes use, that localized optimization. It works great for me, and it doesn't really matter what happens downstream. I mean, if we improve, the engineering output by 10%, and have a 30% reduction in the most profitable part of our business.
Yeah.
Right.
Was that a good move?
Yeah. Right.
No, I think that's a good point. Another one related to this piece of requirements that I've seen people get tripped up on is writing out requirements that aren't really requirements. We wrote it down because that's what we want. Okay, but at the end of the day, when the system that does it costs 3 times as much as the other one, or you're going to have to write a customization to do it, or whatever, there's some reason not to do it. Are you really tied to that? Or was it you wrote down your wish list? So I think that's another be careful, because when you got a lot of people involved, it's hard to meet everybody's needs and you're going to have to find some balance. So don't waste a bunch of time and energy writing down stuff that's just somebody's wish.
Well, and this goes back to the point you made earlier, Jonathan, about when you were talking about kind of speaking out of both sides of your mouth, where we want details, but then in some cases we maybe don't want so much details. Mm-hmm. And there is some balance there, because do I want to write a requirement in a use case, of some report that I need, all the way down to like the column and the font size level, right? This is the report I have today, and this is what I need in the future. Or is that requirement more like, I need a report that tells me all open change orders at any given time?
Right.
So there's a balance to be struck there. There may be some things that you do need to get down to that level of detail. Probably not a lot, but there may be a few. Many of them are, what am I trying to accomplish? There was an analogy, I think I used this in one podcast that we did in the past, where when you show the car to the guy from the 1800s that's only got a horse and buggy, and he says, well, where do I put the hay?
Right.
It doesn't take hay. Well, I need a place to put the hay. That's one of my requirements. And you're missing something, right? No, the requirement was really getting from point A to point B. That was the requirement.
Right.
Maybe we could move on to, because we were talking about, the silos and stuff like that. So maybe we can transition on around that for the, data management and, how to manage the data from older systems and that kind of thing.
I think that is an important point to think about when you're picking a PLM, is what are you going to do with your data, right? What are you going to do with your old data? And even if you're not moving from an existing PDM or PLM system, if you're just moving from, file management or having no system at all, you have to think about how you're going to get any data that you use today to run your business into that new system. And here's the one that people don't think much about, is someday in the future, you're probably going to need to get that data out of this system and into another one when you change and get the latest and greatest thing, 5, 10, 20 years from now. Thinking about that.
Yeah. When you're buying a new house, you're not thinking about moving out of the house already.
You're not, right? You're not. That's not what's on your mind. But I think it's a good thing to think about. I'll say I've seen plenty of customers be frustrated by that. The moving out part, right, is they're ready for that new system, and they find out, oh, well, the system I was using to manage my data before, that actually you can only get at the data through an API, and it's encrypted in the database or the file vault or whatever. And you have to pay for that API. We didn't own that, and those kinds of things. I mean, Derek, what do you see there that people should be thinking about when they're picking?
So this is interesting that this topic comes up in the under the conversation of picking a PLM, right? Because here's what we see. We've selected our PLM, and we're going live in June, and most of the budget has been consumed, by the way. Can you help us get our data over? And it needs to be over for our testing that starts in April.
Right.
That's what we see, right? So,
oops.
And by the way, it's March.
Right, exactly. And so the data migration is often an afterthought. It's something, and I get why, because it is a daunting task for just selecting the system. But what if the system doesn't have a easy way to get your data migrated in? And that could impact go-live timelines. And are those go-live timelines flexible? They may not be. And so that may mean that there's certain systems that we have to look at a little different way because of that. And it's part of the cost of the implementation. So we've looked at all of our use cases. We've looked at what it gives me out of the box, how hard or easy it is to customize, and we've calculated all those costs. And now, what about data migration? We have to calculate those costs too. Some systems are easier to migrate into, than others. And so it certainly needs to be talked about. The other thing is the data migration also gives us, it goes back to that use case point. Because when we start to look at our data, the data from the legacy environment, whether that environment's files and folders or a legacy PLM system, we look at our data, we start to learn a little bit about what we need to do. I do need a system that handles, I don't need anything that handles ME10 CAD. We don't use ME10 anymore. So we don't have to look at ME10. That's data migration time. You've got 20 years worth of ME10 CAD files.
Right.
Maybe I do need a system.
Can you throw that away?
Right.
Well, goodness, no, of course not.
Yeah.
Or what are you going to do with it? Yeah.
So there's something about even understanding our requirements by looking at our data migration and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think you can also, I agree with what you said about being careful when you're doing product selection, just to keep this in mind, because you don't want to get stuck in your implementation. You don't want to get hung up by this kind of thing. But that is a one-time event, right? So it can be a special case and you might have to work around it or, do an incremental migration or something like that. But it brings up another point as we're talking about data, which you really do have to consider, and that is integration, right? Mm-hmm. Because today, PLM still does what PLM's been doing for the last 10, 15 years as these systems have really started to mature. It's managing the data for the product. But as we use it in other parts of our business, we realize, PLM systems are not MES. They're not ERP. They're not these other business systems that we have to run a manufacturing business. So integrating that data and building out a digital thread is something people are paying more attention to now, right? They're thinking about how to put all these systems together to really run their business. Okay, well, when it's time to select a PLM, they're not all created equal when it comes to that point, right? What do you run into there, Derek, or what do you advise people on?
Yeah, that's certainly the case. There are, I would think that most people that are looking at, newer generation PLM systems are absolutely thinking about integration, right? The idea of building a digital thread is everybody's trying to do that. And so I definitely think that you need to look at that. And that's where we get into this conversation that we've been having throughout, which is, the requirements are not just engineering or IT or manufacturing requirements. They go much beyond that. And so I definitely think that you have to ask yourself, what does that eventual digital thread look like? What systems do I need to integrate with? Is it one way, bidirectional? How often, real time, batch, those sort of things? Because that may certainly help us determine, kind of some of the leaders of the ones that we're evaluating. You would be remiss to get into a system. We've selected it. It's a cloud-based system. And all right, let's start integrating these bills of material. Oh, you don't have access. Or to your point, Jonathan, that's part of an API that you didn't purchase.
Right.
And so you need to buy that API in order to get to that system. You really have to think about that, where the data goes from the PLM system. Where else does it need to go?
Well, and I'll connect it back to what you said about data migration informing your system requirements. Same thing here. Data integration informing your system requirements. I'll give you an example. There's a couple of industries where this is the case, so I'll try and make it sort of industry neutral. But there are lots of folks who need to track not only the digital definition of their virtual product, like, what it's going to look like, all, 30 of them that they make, but they need to track each one, right? So each of those 30, they serialize it, they know which parts they produced that went into it, that kind of thing. And so they need to do that level of detailed tracking. And of course, a lot of that is going to come from their MES system or whatever system they use, process they use to build these things up. And there are a number of industries where then that thing has a long life and you're taking a part off of one and putting it onto another, or you're doing an upgrade to it, but you're tracking that thing over its life. Okay, so did you pick a PLM that was going to be able to interface with whatever that other downstream system is that could track, I use serial number 12 on top level serial number 7 and tail number this and ship number, hull number that? Did you think about that, or did you miss the boat, right?
Yes.
Did you pick a PDM or PLM that was, it managed the files and it could generate a bill of material, but it couldn't really connect that up with some other system that's tracking all that serialization. Well, you missed a big requirement, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jonathan. We just had this conversation with the prospect just last week. And this was about an MES system, but it similarly applies, where they're trying to build an integration between their MES system and their ERP system. And the ERP vendor has told them that you cannot not track process plans in the ERP system. The way you're using our ERP system, the process plans have to be here. And the one reason they selected the MES system they selected is because of how nicely it does process plans.
Whoops. Yeah.
Now
funny.
what, right? And so maybe the ERP vendor is a little wrong, and maybe they want them to buy some licenses they don't really need. I don't know, and we'll figure that out. But the point is, if you don't think about that integration point where, hey, I'm going to do process plans here, and then I'm going to send them over here. If you didn't think about that, then maybe you've selected a system that, it's going to cause me problems further down. So you're right. It does help us form our requirements when we think about those integration points.
I think another thing to think about, right, that people should be considering related to requirements and what you were just saying about, the future, where are you going? What are you going to integrate with? What things are you going to do with your system? That future point is a good one. What do you need from your PLM in the future, particularly if you're going to grow, if you're going to change, and nobody can predict the future, right? But I think it is an important thing for people to remember when they're going through those requirements, whether it's, hey, am I trying to apply AI to my PLM,
right,
my digital engineering systems, or I'm going to grow. You know what? I'm going to change my operating model. I'm going to go from being manufacturing on the East Coast and West Coast to decentralized and global manufacturing with contractors. Okay, what does that mean? That means a lot, right? It means a lot about sharing data, those kinds of things. So, I mean, what do you see there with what folks are doing and thinking about their future needs?
Yeah, so I think that that's a very important topic. And what you need to do is each of the vendors out there, each of the competitive vendors, most of them, it's not too hard to figure out what they believe the future is, right? You look at this vendor, you go to their conferences, or you go to read all of the material they've created, and it's very clear that they're like, AI is where we need to be, and that's the future, right? You look at this vendor, and they're like, the future is shop floor integration with sensors on machines, and so that's where we're. And so I think you need to kind of line that up with, hey, we believe AI is the future also in engineering, and this vendor is big on AI, or whatever the case is, and you can kind of start to line some of that stuff up. But I think that is an important point. We made this statement earlier that really most of the major PLM players are going to be able to do most of what you want to do. Yep. Maybe the vendors wouldn't like that. Oh, no, we're the best out there. In reality, it's a Toyota versus a Honda in most cases, right? But if the thing that I need to do is uniquely qualified for a pickup truck, then it's not just Toyota versus Honda. It goes a little bit deeper than that. And so I need to know, how does that vendor feel about what I think the future is. So I think that's definitely important to consider. What is the vendor's view on the future of their platform?
Yeah, that sort of aligning your strategy with their strategy, right? Are they a good fit for me? Are they a good partner? Is something we talked about with Jen Farello a bunch of times. Partnerships. Are we a good fit for each other for the long term, right? Not just transactionally. Hey, I like your PLM product. Let's get it and put it in place. Well, you're signing up for a relationship for at least 5 years, probably 10 or 15.
Right.
Do you expect that they're going to be where you want them to be when you need them to be there in the future?
Right.
And I think that, go ahead, Derek.
We've actually seen this happen, even with some very, very large, Fortune 100 type companies, where they have selected a vendor based on the vendor's hopes and plans. And, if you buy from us, we'll do these things. And only to find out that was good enough until the vendor got the next big $1 billion deal. And then all of a sudden priorities changed. And so that would worry me a little bit. As much as it may make you excited to think that, I've got a vendor on my side that they're basically going to write the system for us. That sounds good at first, but let's think about that. That's today. Right. And so to really, really, to your point, Jonathan, about the partnership, are we of a like mind? Are we, kind of thinking the same thing? Are they heading down the same path we're heading down? Those are all important things.
And I think there's another element of that when we talk about the future and what vendors will do in these time frames. You have to, this is a detail, but it's worth thinking about when you're picking the system. How are you going to upgrade it? How are they going to keep it up over time? Right? Are they going to, it's interesting in the market today because there's some real differentiation amongst vendors on this. Are they going to upgrade it for you? Or are you going to upgrade it yourself? Is it cloud-based and it'll happen? are you okay with it just happening? Right? I mean, there's
Right.
a lot of angles on that, but it's the time component is an important thing to think about when you're picking, right? Because it is not just a transaction for today.
That's right. Yep. Totally agree.
Yeah, well, especially if it's like a major platform change or there's like a major enhancement in technology, like you said, it could really change the dimension of the upgrade, right? So, the complexity of it.
Yeah, well, we know we've experienced places where upgrades are actually migrations, right? I mean, you call them an upgrade and it's a new version of the software, but
Right.
the reality is you're moving your stuff over to kind of a different system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about, we always talk about the people, right?
Yeah.
So I just can imagine the culture change when it comes to a system like this, especially in engineering. Engineers love change. So sorry.
Oh, the irony. But I think you're right, Juliann. I think thinking about what is this going to mean to the user community when you're picking the tool is a good thing, right? Now, this gets into the project, right? So we're talking about picking a PLM system. You need to think about the project you're going to do, but that may influence what your choices are, what you're trying to select. I mean, I'll pick a simple one, Derek, and maybe you've got some others, but just interface stuff, right? I've heard plenty of people say during a product selection, they looked about equivalent functionally, but I got to tell you, this one looks like it was written this decade and that one doesn't, right?
Yeah.
That kind of feedback, and they know what that's going to mean to users. Hey, we got a lot of people around here retiring. We're adding a lot of junior engineers. They're not going to want to work in a system that looks like that kind of stuff. I mean, what do you see there that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, so what is the most, the biggest indication of whether we'll succeed or fail, right? It's not the technology. It's not, how much, it's user acceptance. It's if our users won't use the product, then it doesn't really matter how much time. And, we've all had the executives say, I'm going to stomp my fist and say, you better use it or you'll be out of a job. And they never fire anyone for not using the system because those people are pretty valuable to them. So we have to have a system that is usable. And if those are the things that will make it usable and likable by the organization, then those are the things that we have to consider. And they have to be on our list. We talked earlier about the use cases and testing real world use cases. That's not a use case, but it's possibly a requirement. And so that needs to be out there. And so we have to make sure that we track that sort of stuff. I think it's critically important.
Yeah. I think it's hard to quantify, right? And a lot of people picking these systems, when you're doing it as a business, like we talked about a group earlier, it's hard to put your finger on that one. It's hard to use that one as criteria, but your point is right. It is a requirement. It's just as real as any other requirement and maybe more important than some. But it's tough for people to figure out how to fit that in to their selection process. But it's important to do it.
Right. Well, and it will also, as you mentioned earlier, we talked about this a little bit with data migration, but it also is helps us to form the project also. Mm-hmm. Because if we know that from a user acceptance perspective, this thing's maybe not as great as we would have liked it to have been, then that tells me something about the way I'm going to do training, the way I'm going to evangelize this to the community. So I know a little bit about that.
Yeah, how you're going to help the organization adopt it if there's some kind of hurdle to get over. And to your point, it could mean a lot of things in the project, like, well, somebody doesn't like the interface. All right, well, maybe it's just this one group. We could give them a little different interface. But again, it starts to inform the project, or maybe also your selection of the product. But you should be aware of it so you don't miss that as, oh man, we got totally caught off guard. We didn't think about that when we were picking the product. Right.
And this is something that maybe we should have talked about a little bit earlier, but I think it can dovetail into this idea of change management and training needs. And that's how are you understanding some of those needs from a real world perspective? Am I saying that UI is beautiful because the vendor did a really cool demo?
Right.
Like, wow, that's super easy to use. I mean, did you see that guy? He was just flying through there.
Right.
I used to do these demos. I was pretty good. I demoed some pretty lousy software and made it look
smooth,
really easy. So, for us to determine what those training and organizational change management needs are, we maybe need to wrap our hands around that a little bit. That could require us to do a pilot, pick a small project, pick a small product line, whatever it is. Might cost us some money to implement a small, kind of pilot environment. But isn't that worth it rather than picking the wrong system, implementing it only to find out that our users won't use it? It doesn't really match our rules, that sort of thing.
I think that's good advice. I mean, people should consider that.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of wondering, because a lot of times I hear, maybe in the past I might have heard, when you're in the beginning of the project, you're trying to do in the scoping of everything. It's like, training, that's something we're going to handle. We'll take care of that. Has that shifted at all with, more of the discussions around change management and OCM and that kind of thing where people are now taking it more seriously as part of the whole project? Or is it still one of those, we're going to get to it kind of thing?
I think it's like migration, what Derek said. It's one of those, we got to do that? Hold on,
Okay, yeah.
It's unfortunate, but I think that's right. I think it's right. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Well, what else? We're probably coming short on time, I'm guessing.
I just wanted to touch a little bit on, we're talking about, most of the PLM systems can do the things that people want them to do. But, when you're kind of a smaller company, you're looking at some of these cloud startups, or you're looking at these other, more sophisticated vendors, where does the viability or, we talked a little bit about knowing where people are going with their software platforms and things like that. But how do you make better decisions around the viability of some vendors?
I'll jump in, Derek.
Yeah.
I think you have to pay attention to what you just said, Julianne, but it comes back to that migration point we mentioned earlier too, right? Which is your business might be in a state and you might see a tool that you think is a great fit for you where you want to take a leap, you want to take a little risk, right? Hey, that thing looks perfect. I think that's really going to accelerate what we do. Don't be afraid to do that, but pay attention and ask the right questions for, what happens to my data if you go out of business? What happens to my data if I need to migrate? What happens to my data? Because that's the reality of it is you need to think of your data like it was cash. It's your value, right? If it's intellectual property and it's your product, you need to protect it carefully. You're going to put it in somebody's vault for a little while. You're going to store it there, but at some point you might need to pull it out. If you're worried that your bank might close tomorrow, you just want to make sure, hey, can I get in there and get my stuff out and do something else with it? Because it's mine and it's important to me. I think that's the thing to think about.
Right. And I think that applies. It's not just the startup PLM vendor. It's really a lot of the PLM vendors with the exception of 2 or 3 of them. Mm-hmm. Right? Because even some of the major ones out there that aren't kind of startups, but they've been around for a while and they have an innovative platform, they could be acquired by any one of these major players. Right? There's a couple that are probably pretty safe. They're not going anywhere anytime soon, and they're going to stay on the path, and they've got a long-term roadmap. But really, there's a lot of them that could be acquired by someone, and things could change. So that question is a legitimate question to ask, regardless of how new, innovative, different that the vendor I'm looking at is.
Yeah. I think that makes good sense, right? And it's something to think about as part of your product selection is just make sure you're aware of it. It might not be the driver, but you don't want to miss it. You don't want to get surprised by it, certainly not by an executive like, hey, I heard this. How are we going to deal with that,
Right.
Well, this was a great conversation, gentlemen. I appreciate the dive into this. I think I definitely learned some things as we were going through the areas that, the recommendations, get the right stakeholders in place, capture requirements, and you test real use cases, data migration and integration requirements, future scalability, and upgrading, make sure you cover that aspect. And then the training and how are you going to handle the implementation of the actual system from the user's perspective. And then the vendors. So making sure you know who you're getting and who you're partnering up with, as you say, because it is a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
Did I capture that?
I think so. That feels like a lot of the points. And I hope people listening feel like this wasn't, your typical, write your requirements, do an RFQ. Like that's not really our advice and our thinking, right? Tip-wise for selecting PLM. I think the things you summarized, Julianne, are right on target. And hopefully those are things that if people haven't thought about them, it's given them some ideas.
Yeah, excellent. I agree. Well, as always, there's many more angles for this topic, and I'm sure we'll be back talking about PLM and PLM selection in another format and another time. Thank you so much, Derek, for joining us today.
Thanks for having
We
me.
appreciate you
Thanks
hanging
for
in
being
there.
here.
I know you're not feeling 100% today, but we appreciate you being here. It's always a great conversation with having you on. With that, if anyone has any questions, any comments, or want to suggest anything, or add some information or tips to this conversation, we would welcome that. Just make a comment on our post, and be sure to like our post. We'd love to see the engagement and get some more feedback from you, as this podcast is for you. So, with that, we hope you have a great day, and hope everybody stays sharp.
Stay sharp, everybody.
Thanks for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. If you like this podcast, please be sure to hit the like button or subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform, or check us out on YouTube. If you have any questions or want to leave a comment on our post, please do, or send us an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay sharp.